Hello, everybody, and welcome to WTS Pod. What's the Story Podcast 261 episode. My word. My name is Danny Murray.
And I'm Graham Merrigan.
Graham Merrigan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, man, I'm all right. It's been a couple of weeks since we did this. We take a few weeks off here and there. In our old age, we're looking for more time off. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
OAPs.
This is it. Yeah, we are. But yeah, I'm good overall, man. I'm good overall. This podcast is a bit. I'm conscious of saying like I'm good, but also conscious of what is a terrifying reality.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Feeling guilty for feeling good.
Yeah. We'll get straight to our guest this week, lads, because it's always brilliant having a chat with Dr. Tom Clonan. A security expert, retired captain from the Irish Army, journalism and media man. He's written extensively about security risks to Ireland and security situations around the world. Knows more than a thing or two about a thing or two, and in all the bullshit and bluster that is going on in the world around the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the war that they're waging on innocent people in Ukraine, it pays to listen to people who know what they're talking about. So that's why we've turned to the definitive expert in Dr. Tom Clonan.
And our friend Dr. Tom Clonan returns for his third or fourth visit. I can't remember, Dan. You'll help me out here.
I'm losing track myself, but either way, when we bring them back this many times, it's usually a sign of they're well loved and respected, Graham.
Exactly.
That's how I see it.
Tom, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm good. You gave out to me the last time.
Why?
I thought I was here to be given out to again, but this is good. It's a good start.
No, this is a great start.
Do you remember the last time we spoke? I was saying we should have a national pride march for all of our citizens with disabilities, and you were kind of going, I'm not so sure about that. Anyway,
I can't remember, but I probably did.
Merrow blows hot and cold and all these things, Tom. It depends on what mood you catch them in.
Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was.
It was. It was just all the bad news. Actually, I can't remember.
If he hadn't had his dinner before we recorded, that's it. You won't get any good out of him at all if he's angry.
Oh, it's like the Snickers ads.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we wanted to back on.
Thanks very much for inviting me back, and as always, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. And you always keep me on my toes, so I'm ready.
Lovely.
All my notes here. You can't see them. I have all my notes here.
The Shannon's vote ended today. Was it? Was the last day to vote today? Was it?
Well, the votes have to be in by the 30th of March. So It's coming to the end of the voting cycle. So interestingly, now there's 70,000 registered voters, and only 6,700 have voted. So there are, if I get my maths right now, there's 63,000 votes that have not been returned.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's extraordinary. Like, that is the most privileged community in Ireland. I'm a member of it, Trinity graduates. We're the most privileged and probably the most powerful community in Ireland. And yet less than 10% have voted, which is,
that's crazy, isn't it?
Is that the lowest turnout in the history of the state?
It's a real possibility.
What's the turnout usually for the Shannon, for Trinity?
Well, in 2020, during COVID, it was about 15,000.
Right.
Which again is shockingly low. Like, that's 55,000 people that didn't vote. And I keep thinking, like, Finglas, where I'm from originally, has a population of about 70,000. Same as the Trinity graduates. And if Finglas had 3 senators, think of what they could achieve for that community.
Absolutely.
And I could be wrong now, but I don't think 50 or 63,000 people from Finglas wouldn't bother to vote if they had that opportunity. Like, those votes are very precious. People aren't exercising the franchise. It's a terrible waste. And like, I would have voted for Shannon reform in the last referendum. It hasn't happened. So we have a situation like this where, to be honest with you, I think it's a scandal. If it turns out that only 7,000 or 8,000 people vote, what a waste of taxpayers' money. And it's very disrespectful, I think, to the whole political system, and votes are something that are very hard fought. They're very precious. There are people all around the world who don't have a vote. So to think that the most privileged group in Irish society either are unable to or are unwilling to cast their votes is, it really means that there's a requirement for reform.
So, like, I'm being flippant in this, but is it the privileged are too privileged to vote?
Do you know, I think it's because of the system, which is outside of the control of Trinity now. It's in the legislation. It's registered postal votes. So generally the votes go to the address that the person was living at when they graduated.
Okay.
So that could be their parents' address, or it could be the flat or the apartment or the digs they were living in way back when they got...
that seems crazy as well, Tom, doesn't it?
So they're going to... And because it's a registered post, if there's nobody there to collect it and sign for it, it gets returned. So even if they sent it by Swift Post, you can still track it. There's still a barcode on Swift Post. There's no cost difference. But at least then somebody wouldn't have to sign for it. But I mean, then people might argue, well, that represents a danger to the democratic process. But look, we all got our COVID certs digitally. A very important document. I'm sure that we could do voting in things like this, where you have the electorate all around the world. You could do that digitally.
Absolutely.
We should bring back the electronic voting machines.
They're probably still up in a warehouse in Sandyford.
Yeah. They're like Pac-Man, or I'd say they're very old-fashioned now, I'd say. But it's just like for reasons that I'm running, because of our family situation and other things, it's just kind of frustrating when you see the low turnout.
Absolutely. How are you feeling about it, Tom? Like, how are you feeling? Confident?
I haven't a hope of being. I haven't a hope of being elected. But you know what? This is the third attempt, and probably my last attempt, and so hopefully third time lucky. But it's extremely unlikely I'll be elected. I think there are some very strong candidates there who have the backing of big political parties, like the Green Party or the Labour Party or Fine Gael. And the party machine is being used there to help get them elected. But I would say a couple of things about I've learned an awful lot from running in the election, and it's great to be learning new things in your 50s. I think we've influenced people by the campaign in terms of the issues around disability and the fundamental human rights of people with disabilities. And people have been very positive and very constructive, and so it's definitely, it has been worth it, irrespective of the outcome. And whoever does win, I'll be knocking on their door.
Absolutely,
they'll be knocking on my own door.
yeah, absolutely. What was I going to say to you? So is the Fine Gael? Who's Fine Gael's candidate?
Well, Hugo McNeil would be the preferred candidate of that party. And
the Underwoods.
Yeah, and Hugo's he's a very nice man. He's a very good candidate. He's got a great track record, in fighting for causes. When he was a rugby player, he refused to play in South Africa. And after Canary Wharf bombing, he set up a special rugby sort of a test match in London in the interest of reconciliation and peace. So he's been a good ambassador for Ireland. He's been a good worker for peace. But I just think, though, that the university senators need to be 100% independent, non-party.
Yeah, I think so too.
For example, when Ivana Bacik was the Labour senator for Trinity, we had the crash on austerity between 2011 and 2015. Ivana Bacik, as the Trinity University senator, voted for every single cut to disability supports and services, to the respite carers grant, to respite hours. So on the one hand, she did a lot of talking about equality. But if you look at her actions in the Senate, she just voted with the Labour Party as part of the coalition and hurt the most vulnerable citizens in Irish society. And actually, to be honest with you, that's the reason why I decided to run.
Yeah.
Because as a parent and a carer, as Owen was then as a child, I just thought, how can any senator vote for those things and, you know, purport to be like, I believe our university senators are there to hold the government to account and also to hold our universities to account, to hold Trinity to account in terms of, you know, its activities and how it works and operates. But anyway,
it's
the reason why.
But it's mad though, because I vote in the NUI ones, but like you were saying there, I think it must be. I didn't vote. I think 2020 was the last one anyway. I could be wrong there. I think
yes,
it was.
That was the last one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't vote in it purely because I had moved house, and as you were saying, so. But it's. I wouldn't have been in favour of abolishing the Senate, but certainly reform is needed. And I think the point you were making around that piece in Finglas, can you imagine what 3 seats could do for the people of Finglas? Yeah, that goes across so many areas of this country that if they had representation in the Senate, and it wasn't this kind of elite level of people having access to things, it could make real change. And a lot of stuff you've campaigned on is the kind of change we need to see coming from the upper house.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we live in a society where, as we speak, right, as a single person, if you want to buy a one-bedroom apartment or a home in Dublin, you have to be in the top 3% of earners in the European Union. As a couple, you have to be in the top 5% of earners. So 95% of Irish citizens are excluded from the possibility of owning their own home. And shelter and having a home and a roof over your head is listed as one of the fundamental human rights in the UN Charter of Human Rights. And our society cannot provide that. That is the very definition of a dysfunctional society. And apart from that, then, when you think about persons who need supported accommodation or accessible accommodation, that's impossible. So, for example, Owen, when he turned 18, my son Owen, who's a wheelchair user and has a neuromuscular disease, we put him on the housing list, or he applied himself for the housing list, Leary, Rathdown. And the waiting list for him is about 18 years.
Jesus.
18 years. Now, if something happens to me as his primary carer, then what Owen would be looking at would be going into a nursing home. So these are the reasons why I want to get into the Senate or get into Leinster House, is to, like, we have to fix these things.
A nursing home with old age pensioners.
Pardon?
A nursing home, like as in old age pensioners.
Yeah, at the moment there are approximately 2,000 young people with disabilities living in nursing homes in the Greater Dublin area. And some of these are people with acquired brain injuries. Some of them are people whose, very often what happens is parents die and they go into crisis, and the HSE and the local authorities have no housing. Like, they don't, like, there's, we have a huge homeless and housing problem. So they end up being put into that environment, which is completely inappropriate. I mean, you can't live a fully actualized, happy, meaningful life in that scenario. I mean, so these are the things.
No dignity there or nothing like.
No, and again, look, I mean, I've been saying this for years now. If you said to somebody, you know, you have to live in a nursing home, if that happened to the members of the LGBTI community, or on the basis of ethnicity or religion or sexual orientation, the whole country would be up in arms, and quite rightly so. But for some reason, as it applies to people with disabilities, there's almost like a tolerance of it. You know, there's a deafening silence on it. And that's why, whilst I do have huge respect for my competitors who are running for the Senate, how many of them will be prepared to make an almighty racket about these issues? Because that's what I want to do. And I'm not interested in becoming a TD or becoming, my only reason is to get into Leinster House and make that noise and to vote against every single piece of legislation that empowers vulture funds or empowers, cuckoo funds or anything like that. We need to build houses like we did in the 70s and the 60s when we hadn't a pot to urinate in.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's some dysfunctional things there.
So depressing.
It's not rocket science, but like I was saying to you, what is the point of having a digital economy, 30% of Europe's data in 54 data centers around the country? What's the point of having shiny big industries, pharma, tech, if our citizens cannot aspire to have their own home? Because if you can't aspire to have your own home, then you can't make decisions about will I have kids? Or, where do the big neoliberal behemoths who've come up with this way of this design for living in Ireland, where do they think that their next generation of consumers are going to come from? There has to be a place for people to live. So I think the economy probably has been fixed to some extent. Now we have to fix our society. It revolves around things like health, access to education, access to housing. And we need more voices like that in the Senate. We don't need the same old Labour Party, Green Party, Fine Gael. We don't need people like that in the Senate, especially on the university panels. And that is not to be critical of the individuals. It's just that by virtue of the fact that they're members of political parties, they will have to follow the party whip.
Yeah.
In fact, I know that at least one of those candidates had to get permission from the party to run. That's not a good start.
No, it's not a good start at all.
How can you be an independent if you have to look for permission to run in the first place? But anyway. Of course, I had to ask permission too from the boss.
yeah. That's different.
That's not a party political thing. That's just more of
yeah.
I just do what I'm told.
You've been writing brilliant articles recently, and informing people in regards to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Where are we with that now, Tom? Did Putin think he'd be in there for this long?
No way. I mean, this is the most extraordinary story. So I've been writing about this for some months, and when the invasion started, Putin had concentrated up to 170,000 troops on the border with Ukraine.
Jesus.
For a particular type of troops. They were mechanized infantry, armored divisions, and big tank formations. And they were all designed, if you were to design an invasion force, that's what it would consist of. It's like the cavalry. So these are all designed to be fast moving, cover ground very, very quickly, like shock troops. It would be a lightning invasion. So on the 24th of February, when the Russians rolled across their start lines and went into Ukraine, I was writing in the journal and saying in interviews on RTE that this was going to be a very fast moving and brutal conflict. Now, I got one bit right. It has been brutal and will get more brutal, but it has not been fast moving. And the whole world, the military and intelligence and defense community are going to be writing about this for decades. It's extraordinary how spectacularly the Russians have failed.
Really?
To take ground. So they've been in Ukraine for a whole month of combat, with troops who had already been concentrated on the start line for some of them since December. So these same troops have been in the field now for months. They've only taken Kherson. Mariupol will probably fall, but only after they've destroyed it. And that column moving down from Belarus and the Russian border to Kiev, that column has been moving for 24, 25 days, and it has only traveled 200 kilometers. Now,
What?
yeah. And
Is that just because of Ukrainian resistance then, is it?
And and this is down the E95 motorway. Like, they're moving something like 3 or 4 miles a day in mechanized, state-of-the-art vehicles that are designed to go quickly. Now, the average adult male or female, not fit, just the average adult male or female, can walk 4 miles in an hour. Like, you could have walked from Moscow to Kiev in the length of time that it has taken them to move their armor. So that is a spectacularly slow-moving, stalled invasion. And we know that the Ukrainian resistance, the Ukrainian military, supplied by weapons from the West, the new generation, state-of-the-art, light anti-tank weapons. These are shoulder-fired weapons. You fire and forget. They lock onto the target. They have now been proven on the battlefield that Russia's biggest tanks, with their most advanced armor and anti-missile systems and reactive armor systems, they're extremely vulnerable to these. So one guy or girl with a light anti-tank weapon, which costs, I don't know, they're made in Belfast, actually, in what used to be the Shorts missile factory. So basically for €2,000 or €5,000, whatever it costs, you're taking out a tank that costs millions, and the crew, which, young Russian soldiers, in a split second. So the Ukrainian military have been supplied with tens of thousands of these light anti-tank weapons. And it would appear to be the case that they've targeted the armor, they've targeted the petrol tankers, the logistics and supplies. So for a combination of reasons, the resistance, the use of Western weapons, which has exposed the vulnerability of the ground element of the Russians. So the Russians are in trouble in terms of their ground forces. But that is that doesn't mean that Ukraine has won the war. But what it does mean is that Putin and the Kremlin are now running out of military options. So after a month, they failed to take Kiev, they've failed to take Kharkiv or Sumy. So they're going to get frustrated, they're going to get angry. So being denied a conventional military victory, they're now resorting to targeting the civilian population by kettling them into those cities, refusing to let them leave on protected evacuation corridors, by opening fire on people who leave through agreed evacuation corridors. So they're using the civilian population as a kind of a leverage, denied the conventional ground victory that they hope to get very quickly, like within a week. They're now targeting that population, starving them, cutting off the water supplies, the electricity, the food, in an attempt by cruelty and force majeure to get a surrender from those cities' mayors. And in addition, because their ground troops aren't doing so well, they're increasingly relying on their air force and their missiles to attack targets in those cities. So to put that in context, the Russians have a lot of ballistic missiles, like the cruise missiles that the West used, like NATO used in Afghanistan, like Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Russians have thousands of those. One variant is called Caliber, and it has a warhead of 500 kilograms of high explosives. Now, to put that in context, 500 kilograms is a half a ton. If you get a cigarette packet size of high explosives, I don't know how much that would weigh, maybe 50 or 60 grams. And if you put that under someone's car and detonated it, you wouldn't recognize the car after the explosion. You'd have to send it for a forensic examination to even determine what make of car it was. That's the explosive power of HE, or plastic explosives, right? So can you imagine what 500 kilograms of that will do? So when you see pictures from Ukraine of an entire apartment block that has been destroyed in a missile strike, that's what they're doing. They're sending that amount of high explosives into built-up civilian areas, which is contrary to the Geneva Conventions, which forbids an attacking army from firing on civilian objects or civilian targets. And if they do so, it's referred to in the Geneva Conventions as willful and wanton killing. So that's what the Kremlin have resorted to now.
Yeah.
And as the Russians become more and more frustrated by these weapons being supplied from the West, they will begin to target further and further to the West themselves. So they've already hit Lviv, and they'll start to hit the border crossings with Poland, probably Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, because the only way to get weapons from Europe into Ukraine is over those land borders, because airspace is dominated by Russian Air Force. So the risk of escalation in this conflict is very high.
Yeah.
I'm kind of hoping that somehow Putin or those in his inner circle that empower him and support him, that they'll see that this thing is going nowhere.
But if they see that it's going nowhere, and as you said, you didn't expect, nobody in kind of your frame of work didn't realize that this was going to go on for as long as it did. Like, he's not gonna retreat. He want his ego massaged here, won't he?
Yeah. Well,
how do you do that?
Well, the original estimate of the situation was that he had enough troops to secure Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass region. They had declared themselves as independent republics, and he sent in peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers. And that was his most powerful moment. He had enough troops and equipment to do that, to consolidate that grab, if you like, and create a buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. And they also had enough maybe to do this land corridor that they're trying to create between Mariupol through up towards Luhansk and Donetsk, which would be a land corridor from the Crimean Peninsula up into the Donbass and into Russia. They probably had enough stuff to do that. And if they had left it at that, the world would probably, shake their fist at the Kremlin, and there would have been some sanctions, and Putin could have said, well, look, I've achieved our strategic military objective. But instead of that, he's decided, right, I'm going to take the whole of Ukraine or half of Ukraine, which is impossible. You cannot occupy a country of 45 million people. And here's an interesting comparison. The population of Ukraine is about 40 million, give or take. The population of Afghanistan is about 40 million, give or take.
There you go.
The United States and NATO could not occupy that country. And after 20 years, they were, they literally ran out of there. They flew out of there up until the 31st of August, chaotic. Okay. Iraq has a population of about 40 million people. The West could not occupy. They were able to destroy Saddam Hussein's regime and they were able to wreck the place, but they could never occupy it. They were never safe outside the green zone. They failed. But Putin benefited from both of those failed occupation attempts, because Russia is now the biggest player, along with China, in Central Asia after NATO left Afghanistan. And Russia is a power broker in the Middle East with Iran after, the United States and our allies have departed that region. So why did Putin, having benefited from failed attempts to do this, why did he decide, what, I'm going to repeat the mistakes of my enemies and try to hold 45 million people at gunpoint, which we know you can't do? My guess is that Putin is now in some kind of a bubble in the Kremlin where he's not hearing criticism, even the most constructive and realistic criticism. So there have to be people around him who at some point are going to realize this war is not good for Russia. It's not good for the Russian people. It's not good for Ukraine. It serves no purpose. And it has not divided or weakened NATO or the European Union. On the contrary, it has made the Union more cohesive.
It's given NATO something to almost unite over, which have probably lacked for quite some time, some would argue.
The Trump administration undermined that, but now you've got 100,000 troops, NATO troops, coalescing in the Central European states up along the borders with Ukraine. So the whole thing is a disaster. But my fear would be that if Russia hits targets on those border crossings to prevent the supply of weapons, and if he accidentally or deliberately hits Polish border forces, for example, or Polish troops, then that's an attack on NATO. And then we have a war, a de facto war between Russia and NATO. And that's the kind of thing.
And so what would we see in that situation? Would we see NATO attacking land in Russia? Would we see NATO attacking Moscow?
You'd see a bright flash. Like a photograph, and then that would it would be apocalyptic. I mean, I think so. We know that Russia's ground forces aren't great. They're not capable of combined arms operations. So if there was an exchange between NATO and Russia, it would be air attacks, but most likely intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they would probably start off with conventional ones. And, Russia, with even those short-range cruise missiles, could hit cities like Krakow. They could hit places in Slovakia, Bratislava, Warsaw. But I mean, this is unthinkable.
Yeah.
Vilnius. But in response to that, Russian cities like Rostov-on-Don would be targeted. And then it's only a matter of time. And Putin threatened this on the 24th of February. He said, if the West interferes with our operations in Ukraine, we will use a response that has not been seen before in human history. And then on the 28th of February, he put his nuclear forces on what he calls special alert.
Yeah.
So he has introduced already into the scenario the prospect of a nuclear exchange. So even the most modest tactical nuclear weapon, if it was fired at a European city, would result in the deaths of millions of people, because even the smallest tactical nuclear weapons they have now are hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs you would have read about in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, and contaminate huge areas of Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. They'd be uninhabitable. It would be a human catastrophe, a climate catastrophe. So we have to do everything in our power to stop us getting to that point.
Look, obviously it's a very, very, very serious situation, and it's one which I think people are frightened, people are scared, they're trying to understand what's happening. And as you said there, Tom, Putin is more than likely in this bubble where he's kind of being told certain things that 100% don't reflect the truth. And if we can kind of get you to put on the cap you wear when you're talking to journalism students about the importance of kind of truth in media and that kind of thing, you look at what's going on in Russia, and a couple of days ago, Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow was packed to the gills with this Trump-esque propaganda show where Putin came out and had it. He was speaking, and if the TV pictures were anything to go by, massive support from thousands of people there. State media in Russia is infamous. All the independent TV and radio is being shut down. Protesters are being arrested hand over fist. But then there seems to be this big, large chunk of Russian people who believe everything that comes out of the Kremlin. So how do people kind of look at it and say, well, what side is the truth and what side is the spin?
Yeah, it's very difficult for ordinary Russians to access information in the way that we can. But I've always felt that there's propaganda on all sides. So there's propaganda on the NATO side as well. So you have to kind of make up your own mind and think about the evidence before your eyes. So as we were saying last week, I was in Budapest, I was working there for a couple of days last week. When I got to the airport, I mean, lots of Irish people will have been to the airport and will have been to Budapest for, a weekend break or a midweek break. And so what struck me, first of all, when I got into the airport was when you go out into the arrivals area, there were lots and lots of Ukrainian family groups sitting around big suitcases, looking at all the departure signs. I went outside then to get a bus into town, and all the airport car parks were full of minibuses and buses with Ukrainian people getting in and out of them. The same in town and in Budapest city centre, the train station was packed with Ukrainians out in the streets, again, with like suitcases, children, cat carriers, pets. So for me, that's evidence I can see with my own eyes.
Yeah.
That millions of people on the move. And why are they on the move? They're running for their lives. And they're running this way. They're not running to Russia. So whilst there is propaganda on all sides, it's clear from what's happening that, Russian forces are in breach of the Geneva Conventions with regard to the targeting of built-up areas and towns and cities. What I'm saying to the journalism students is, look, one of the things about war and conflict that I think is very important, like when you have a journalist who specializes in agriculture, you expect them to know the difference between a cow and a bull. A journalist that specializes in fashion, you would expect them to know the difference between Prada and Gucci. Sport, they'll know all about the difference between cricket and rugby, or, they're experts. But a lot of war reporting, I'm sorry to say, is carried out by people who have no expertise and who are adrenaline junkies and who stay in hotels in cities very often, not actually close to the front line. Some of them do, and some of them pay a very high price for that. But I'm hearing report after report after report coming out from Ukraine by US and UK correspondents who kind of describe things, I've seen today at a checkpoint, I saw XYZ, but they have no way of contextualizing it or saying what's the difference between an offensive or a defensive operation, what's legal, what's illegal. And I think there's a reliance in Irish media, on our state broadcaster particularly, on talking heads from so-called think tanks in the UK and the US that have a really clear political agenda. They're not independent, objective reporters. And also I've heard a lot of analysis here that is simply inaccurate or wide of the mark. So what I would say to journalists, educate yourself and try and find out, what the terms mean, acquaint yourself with international law. There are very simple textbooks for journalists that actually have been written for journalists by international law experts, explaining what's legal, what's illegal, what constitutes crime. And that would, get rid of some of the doubt in people's minds about what should we do next. Like, we have to stand with Ukraine. This isn't just a battle for Ukraine. It's a battle for European values. Do you want to live in a world where it's dominated by strong men like Putin? Or do you want a world where we give out our politicians all the time, but we can get rid of them every 5 years,
Are we a little bit paying the price here for a couple of years ago when Barack Obama was in the White House and he said the use of chemical weapons in Syria is an absolute red line. Chemical weapons were then used, and it was kind of like, oh no, and a wag of a finger and a shake of a fist and that kind of thing. But nothing really happened. Putin, obviously, in Russia and Bashar al-Assad, bedfellows. Like, as Putin looked at that and kind of went, all right, then there's something I can take away from this, and I can be a bad bastard and nothing's going to happen to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, people like me, and I've been given out there saying people should know what they're talking about. But the Obama administration were outmaneuvered to some extent by Sergei Lavrov in relation to the incident. But we should have seen the warning signals when the Kremlin were prepared to use radioactive poisoning to kill, I think it's Litvinenko.
Yeah. Alexander Litvinenko, yeah.
That was terrible, yeah.
In the UK. And they were also prepared to use nerve agents indiscriminately in the UK. You know,
the Salisbury poisons,
yeah. So the writing was on the wall then, up to at the time of the Litvinenko murder, that here is a leader who's prepared to use mass destruction indiscriminately against a country that is a member of NATO, and there was no real consequences for him personally.
So what should have been the consequences, or what could have been? Like what can you do, and what could Britain have done in that case?
Well, I mean, our hands are tied in the West because we follow a rules-oriented system. Well, for most of the time. And you're dealing with somebody who is, I would say now, based on what we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine, who's disinhibited, who's reckless, but I think we've reached a point now where that, we have no choice. And if chemical weapons are used in Ukraine, and I hope not, then it's like the moment that Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, or it's like the moment when the Reichstag was burnt down. It's going to be a turning point, and it's not going to be it's going to be very difficult for Europe, and it's going to change Europe.
From an Irish perspective, Tom,
we've no choice though. We have to. The guy isn't going to stop now.
Yeah, well, it's that old thing. He's waded so far into the water that to turn back would be just as tedious as to keep going, kind of thing. He's it's hard to see, even like when I say a win here, I realize it's not a term that kind of sits well with any kind of war, but like what could a win actually mean for Putin? Even if he manages to take Ukraine, and as you said earlier, can't occupy the place, he doesn't have the resource, doesn't have the power. So what does a win ultimately look like for the guy in the long term?
To find out what a win looks like, you have to look into the recent past. So in 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia. Again, they used about 150,000 troops. They used the mechanized armor tank formations. And they completed that invasion of Georgia in 10 days. They turned the whole thing around in 10 days. And when it was over, they kept 1/5 of Georgia's territory as a buffer zone. And this really bolstered Vladimir Putin's credibility as a great leader, as a strong man, restored Russia's glory. In the case of Ukraine, if you want to be really cynical and talk about it in terms of realpolitik, if he had gone in and out in 10 days and managed to secure about 1/5 of Georgia's territory, i.e. the Donbass and this land corridor down to Crimea, well, that's what a victory would have looked like. But unfortunately, he wanted to kill Zelensky, essentially. I think he found him very offensive, very provocative. And Vladimir Putin, it would appear, has a very fragile ego. He's got very brittle ambitions. And before we get to the next level, which will stop the war, but at a catastrophic price for Europe, before we get to that level, if we could stop this war in the meantime, if we could de-escalate, if there was a way that Putin could be persuaded to take a pause, and I'm thinking like if there was some issue around the nuclear power stations where there was the threat of another Chernobyl, which would be as toxic for Russia as it would for everybody else, that Putin might say, you know what, I'm a reasonable man, and in the interests of humanity, I'm going to take a pause so that we can deal with this situation. So there has to be some kind of safe face-saving moment for Putin, or else the people around him have to move him aside. And I would love to see him, after such a move, at some point in The Hague, answering war crimes against humanity. But the alternative is that he kills so many people that he feels he's proven a point that, the Russian bear really does have claws. And I hate even using the word Russia, because this isn't Russia. This is Putin and his kleptocracy and the people who are enabled and benefited by him, the ordinary Russian people they're wonderful people, and this is just tragedy. But principally for Ukrainians, they're in price.
When you said about them potentially being moved aside, like you mentioned Sergei Lavrov earlier, Dmitry Medvedev has had a stint in the hot seat, albeit very much in a puppet format when Putin wasn't president for a while there. I think it was 2012 or whatever. Like, there's no political opposition in Russia. There's no. Is there any way of? Are we relying on the old guard to essentially look at this and have a change of heart and say we have to move them aside, or is there any other way for them to be moved aside peacefully?
Oh, the way it works in Russia, I mean, like Navalny is the popular opposition, and he's in prison now for 9 years, having already served, or I think he was already sentenced to 2 years.
And they sentenced him yesterday to 9.
And they tried to poison him as well there last year too.
So I don't, and like the demonstrations in the streets, these are very, very brave people, but whatever, if there was to be regime change, it has to come from that inner circle of people who empower him and enable him. And to be honest with you, I have no idea who might emerge from the woodwork. Putin himself came out of nowhere. Like, he was a major in the KGB. He was in the right place at the right time. Well, the wrong place at the wrong time. And he managed to consolidate his power and hold his grip on power. But that's all built on this kleptocracy of bribes and paying people. But there's the oligarchs, then there's the security and military securocracy of, I think I've heard it called. That might be the group that say, we can't deliver on your ambition. We just can't. The Russians love their children just as much as we do, and they're as terrified of the prospect of nuclear exchange as we are. They are.
Yeah.
Probably more frightened because it's not clear that their technology will actually work in the way that they think it will, given the evidence of what's just happened on the ground. So I think at a certain point within that group of people, they'll say, we cannot deliver on this anymore. No, we're not going to nuke a Polish city because we want to continue to, there's no point being the winners if the world is destroyed.
I was going to say that to you, like you were talking, if a border town is hit accidentally or whatever, that you could be looking at apocalyptic times. But like, surely Putin doesn't want that. Surely he wants to live in his mansions and his yachts, and he wants to enjoy all that. So what do you see? What do you really see happening here? Like,
well, I think he's nihilistic. He's grandiose. He's got delusions of power. I'd say he lives a very, very narrow life. I don't think he enjoys his yachts or his helicopter or his planes. I'd say he sleeps with a gun under his pillow. I'd say he knows he hasn't got long left.
Really? In terms of long left, in terms of power, like being in power.
Yeah, his life. I mean, he's 70.
Yeah.
He's not the kind of guy now who can retire and go to Nice or Monaco and play in the casino.
He's going out all guns blazing then.
Well, that's the risk, that he might want to go out with a bang. I mean, look, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but if you look at the history of authoritarian, dictatorial people like him, they get to a point where they start to become ever more paranoid because he knows he's coming to the end. So the trick is, can this insane war, this criminal war, can it be brought to a halt in a way that doesn't cause the destruction of millions and millions of lives? If we can preempt that in some way. And hopefully there are people in Russia, I'm sure there are people in Russia who are thinking about this. People who can make that change.
Hopefully. From an Irish perspective, Tom, should, as I said earlier, that the border area be hit with Poland or Slovakia or one of those, and suddenly NATO find themselves going into a conflict, or the EU suddenly find themselves with very, very tough questions to answer. A lot has been made of this kind of Irish neutrality conversation over the last couple of weeks, and I've heard different things from different politicians, and I've heard different things said around, militarily neutral, but politically we're not. At what point does Ireland have to kind of go, oh, okay,
Well,
what's our move?
Well, I'll answer that as quickly and as simply as I can. NATO does not want to declare war on Russia.
Yeah.
Because that's World War III. And that's why they won't do the no-fly zone. Because to have a no-fly zone, the first thing you'd have to do is destroy Russia's integrated air defense systems. So the first thing you'd have to do is have a series of airstrikes and missile strikes from NATO on targets in Belarus and inside Russia. So NATO would declare war on Russia, World War III. NATO doesn't want to do that. But if Russia hits a European border area or people or a city or a town, then Russia has started World War III. And all bets are off. NATO will respond. The European Union will respond. And Ireland, whether we like it or not, will be part of that. Just as we were in World War II. We might be militarily neutral, but we will politically support the defence of Europe. And anyway, Ireland can't contribute militarily in such a scenario because our defence forces are, they're
non-existent.
They're irrelevant, really. They don't have the skill sets or the kind of experience to be part of a joint effort like that. And that's the thing that, that's the nightmare scenario that we have to try and avoid. But in relation to our neutrality, we don't have to be a member of a military alliance. And that's one of the things I've been nervous about in the discussion around Ukraine. Some politicians saying that we should join NATO or we should join a European military alliance. No, we shouldn't. Because over the last 30 or 40 years, we have contributed to NATO operations. We have contributed, like in Afghanistan, in Kosovo. We have contributed to European Union military operations in Chad, Central African Republic. So we can play our part and contribute, when situations like this arise, but we do it at a time of our choosing and not as part of a military alliance. Because at the moment, Ireland has a little voice, but as soon as we join a military alliance, we will disappear because we'll suddenly then become 0.0001% of the military capability of something that will be led by Germany and the United States or France. So, we need to keep our sovereignty.
I'm conscious of time and we're probably opening up cans of worms with kind of these questions that can't really be answered in a meaningful way in a short space of time. But it seems to, and I'm obviously I've no real knowledge or experience of the Irish Defence Forces, but it seems like respected and everything with all the peacekeeping stuff and whatnot. But a great example of one of our problems was there recently when I've seen the jokes and whatever, it was the Irish fishermen who defeated the Russian Navy or whatever. It's like, does that open up the question to, right, we the modern world requires us to start looking at actually investing more in our defence forces and our capabilities? Or are we just too small that we'd be never in a position to be able to defend ourselves, even with the investment?
We should invest in our defence forces, and the first thing we should do is pay them properly. Because,
absolutely, yeah. Well, that's
they're earning less than the minimum wage, and to be a neutral state, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And we're the only state in the European Union that can't control or monitor its airspace. We can't control or monitor the maritime space, which is going to be super important in the future. We have 220 million acres of ocean. And that's where all the wave and wind energy is going to come from. Ireland owns 1/5 of Europe's waters. It's ours. It's our exclusive economic zone. And, we see now the problems with reliance on Russian gas and oil. Ireland we could become world leaders in the production of wind and wave energy. But to do that, we have to be able to patrol it, secure it, mind it. So we need to invest in our Navy to do that. And our Army, I was saying earlier, they don't have the skill sets. I don't mean that militarily. I just mean in terms of scale. Because in any war between NATO and Russia, and I hope it doesn't happen, you're talking about divisions, army group levels. Irish tactical operations, really, I'd say the maximum we could do it at is battalion strength. And that's not a criticism of the Army. It's just a fact in terms of scale. And we've done more than peacekeeping in the last 20 years. We've done a lot of peace enforcement. But I suppose I'll finish out in this. Like, as an army officer, I experienced conflict in Lebanon during Operation Grapes of Wrath, where the civilian population were targeted by the Israelis in airstrikes, helicopter gunship attacks, artillery bombardments on built-up towns and villages. And I've seen at firsthand what happens to people in that environment. The killing of children, like what's happening in Ukraine. And nobody who's seen that or who's been there would say anything other than let's try to de-escalate and let's not join a military alliance. Let's not send our children into that kind of a space. Let's let Ireland be a force for peace in the world. It's worth it.
Absolutely. Here. Yeah. Tom, it's always a pleasure chatting to you, and the knowledge and experience you bring to these conversations, certainly a lot more than me and Mero can offer people. So that's appreciated.
It's interesting though. It's so interesting listening to you, because listening to you on Eamon Dunphy this week as well, and it's just it's scary, but it's just fascinating and interesting. Like you know the way you reference the Geneva Convention and stuff like that. Like, why bother have these conventions if world leaders are just going to be so, like, they're going to be megalomaniacs to ruin people's lives and to kill people just for what? There's no real reason, like, other than their ego.
I mean, this is history repeating itself. Like, we had Hitler did this. We've seen other people do it. Like, you've got Kim Jong-un or...
Yeah, it's him. Yeah, Kim Jong-il was to that.
I mean, there is an antidote to all of this. There is a radical proposal put forward by feminists that women should take over. And not in a patriarchal way, not like Margaret Thatcher, who collaborated with and extended patriarchal discourses, but that women and girls should take over the world and do it. Let's try it that way and see if that's less violent and if that's less harmful to the planet and harmful to one another. We've had patriarchal systems, and Putin, like Trump, is the very, very expression of patriarchal values.
Absolutely.
It's no good.
No, it's not. I agree with you, by the way.
Toxic masculinity has a lot to answer for, and it's something that we've talked about on this podcast. We've heard of plenty of other places as well, that more female representation in politics and more female representation at the top tables. It can't be a bad thing, diversity of thought helps.
Get them back into the schools in Afghanistan, and
absolutely
empower women and girls all around the world. And, that'll be a good first step towards preventing this type of thing from happening again.
Let the Irish mammy rule the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just there'll be wooden spoon clatters everywhere.
Hey, listen, guys, been
thanks
great
very much.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks very much.
All the best with the Shandal election, Tom, and thanks again for all the work as well around raising awareness. Really, really great stuff.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks, Danny. We'll see you soon.
Man, it is like scary, but like I don't want the fearmonger, but like that possibility of us going over a cliff edge into a territory nobody wants to is you can't ignore it, can you? No, and I like, yeah, and it's hard to get your head around why this is happening. It's hard to fathom why diplomacy didn't work here. He didn't want diplomacy though. I think Tom touched on it. He basically wanted Zelensky dead, and I think now, and me and you talked about this separately, where I'm not necessarily buying into this. I think there's a massive cult of personality around Putin, and that's a whole different thing. But this kind of surge in Zelensky, I don't know enough about the guy, and he may be all things sweet and innocent, he may be all things wholesome or whatever, but I think now Putin has to know, if he kills Zelensky, it's a completely different thing than if he had killed Zelensky in the first 2 days of this onslaught. Yeah. So like, would he have, let's say, right, I'm just wondering, as experts like Tom had suggested that, Putin thought this was going to be well over with it, certainly within 10 days. Yeah. So were the orders
were the original orders when you get the Kiev kill Zelensky? Like,
well, I don't know. I mean, we should definitely sort of just caveat here. We should just definitely say the expert is gone now. So
yeah,
everything you're
we
hearing,
aren't experts.
everything you're hearing now is just the opinion of two very, very, very silly men from Ballybrack who, let's be honest, we still laugh at farts, Graham. You know, so like when it comes to these international geopolitical matters, you know, if there was footage of Vladimir Putin farting, I'd be laughing watching it. So I'm probably not the best person to, but nonetheless, we'll go ahead with the conversation anyway. I don't know. I honestly don't know if kind of, I wouldn't be surprised if there were orders of take Kiev, take Zelensky. And because you have to remember, the whole thing was sold by Putin to the Russian people and everything else on the denazification of Ukraine, that Ukraine was being ruled by Nazis and drug addicts.
So drug addicts. So do you think Putin thought that what the start of this invasion that we were going to see scenes of Ukrainians jubilant in the streets that they are no longer oppressed?
Absolutely. So this, you can learn a lot from history. And Tom Clonan, the actual expert who's no longer with us, I'll just repeat that again.
He's still alive and well.
He is still alive. Yeah, sorry, yeah. When I say no longer with us, I mean on this podcast, not in this earth. This is but history often does repeat itself, and you can learn a lot from it, right? And there was the Soviet war with Finland in 1939 and 1940 has a lot of similarities to what we're seeing now, in that the Soviet leadership were fully of the belief that they would roll over the border into Finland and be greeted with women throwing knickers at them, that they'd be greeted in the streets as heroes. There'd be trumpets and marching bands in front of them saying, welcome in, let's go to Helsinki. We're so happy you're here to save us from our despot dictators that we have. The reality was the complete opposite. And the Russians couldn't believe, or the Soviets as it was, couldn't believe the resistance. And Finland only has a population of like 5 million, bearing in mind. It's nowhere near the size of Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. And after 3 months of Russians getting bogged down, Soviets I should say, sorry, getting bogged down in Finnish forests, making absolutely fuck all progress, getting battered by Finnish guerrilla war tactics and all sorts of things, eventually a Moscow peace treaty was signed, because the Russians realized we're too far down a one-way street to reverse. We can't get to the far end of the street like we want to. This isn't going to happen. So it was a little bit humiliating for them, but they saved face.
But this is the same case though, because he went all like the language that's being used here, you know, even from the Americans and even Boris Johnson, like they were like, Boris Johnson probably would have thought, you know, oh yeah, I've got a friendly relationship with Putin. And then 2-3 days into this war, into this invasion, you have Boris Johnson calling Putin a dictator
and a war criminal. Yeah,
and they never would have called him that anymore. So where is the way back? Like if you were to host a neutral treaty, like who would be the people involved? Who would be the countries involved?
Well,
how do we see the US administration in the future, the UK administration in the future? How do we see the superpowers, so-called superpowers of the world, realign with Moscow now?
Well, this is it, and this is the thing. Superpowers are essentially counterweights against each other, and they're a bit like supermassive stars. They will eventually implode upon themselves. So we're already at that. The two brightest stars in our galaxy are dying. The age of the American empire is on its way out, and Russia, which looked like a big bright star in terms of its capabilities, and it turns out it's not actually as big as we thought it was. And more than likely, when it goes, it's going to go with a whimper rather than a bang in terms of that implosion. It's a massive, massive state. And like the difference between society in Western Russia, in your kind of Moscows, your St. Petersburgs, down into your kind of Black Sea resorts like Sochi, over then across the Ural Mountains towards Rostov-on-Don and Omsk and, you know, the Novgorod and all these kind of big cities. The further east you go and the further into that kind of Siberian forest and that Siberian tundra you get over towards the Asian continent, it becomes a completely different way of life, completely different culture. There are people, remember, like on one side of Russia, you've got Moscow, and on the other side of it, there are cities that are closer to Alaska and Anchorage in Alaska than they are to another Russian city. So it's such a vast place that you've got just mad variance in terms of views and politics and society and culture and
so sorry, not to be rude, but what is the point that you're making with that?
My point is that realistically, these superpowers, they can't last forever. So when Russia goes, and this is purely just my opinion based on kind of like, the bits that I read and sort of knowledge.
Yeah, but you're an intelligent man, so you're allowed to have an opinion like that.
We're playing fast and loose with the term intelligent. What I'm saying to you is, I think there's a real possibility that in 20 years' time, the Russian Federation as it is today does not exist as it is today. And what you will get are a series of caucuses and republics. So you've already got semi-republics within Russia.
And is that as a result of people fed up with Putinism?
Yeah, and the inability of the Kremlin to actually impact and affect outcome across the vastness of the Russian Federation. Yes. Man. So I think, like a lot of people sort of say, the world is looking further east. They're looking at China. They're looking at India and Japan to an extent in terms of the rise of the next superpowers. I don't know enough about that. I don't know how true that is. But what I do think is America doesn't have the influence it once does, and it's not seen the way it was. And Trump has done a lot of damage on that, but it was probably already in the twilight years.
Yeah, I think Afghanistan and Iraq probably had something to do with that.
But quite possibly. And I think Russia, Putin done a lot. In fairness, like you have to remember, there's been sort of 30 years of Russia removing that Soviet label to try and integrate towards Western ways and to try and, like you've got up until the early 1990s, you didn't have things like McDonald's in the Soviet Union. You didn't have Levi jeans and Western music and Western cinema and all that kind of thing. If you wanted that stuff, it was illegal to have it, and you had to have bootleg copies of it and all that kind of stuff. And that's why disco music to this day is so popular in Russia, because the bootlegs that went over were things like Boney M and stuff like that. So this Western culture and all this effort that went to integrating it, and let's not forget, when oligarchs get their money, they're not buying fucking Ladas. They're buying Porsches. They're buying Mercedes. They're buying Audis. They don't want to regress back towards an Eastern way of life.
Why aren't the oligarchs putting pressure on Putin now with the sanctions?
It's a great question. It's a great question, because a lot of them are fucking now pretty much flat broke.
Yeah. So did they not have that much power over Putin that they thought they had? I would say just Putin just literally going on a solo run here.
I don't know if he's going on a solo run. I'd say there's a lot of oligarchs. I'd say there's a few WhatsApp groups with a couple of oligarchs, and there's a lot of WTF mate going on. But what ultimately what are they going to do? Because even if, let's just say Putin drops dead tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right, sanctions aren't going to be lifted. They're not going to have access to their money straight away, so they don't have access to their power straight away. So their money is in their power. If they were able to corrupt and bribe somebody to be able to do something here, they'd be relying on the assets that are frozen and that they cannot touch right now because of international sanctions. So they're a little bit toothless. They're a big bad dragon that has no teeth and can't breathe fire.
Right.
So it's. Yeah.
That's they are the ramblings of two amateur history buffs. If you want to follow more, you should follow Tom Clonan on his Twitter page at Tom Clonan, CLONAN, and he's been writing extensively in journal.ie, RTE. He's been on Eamon Dunphy's podcast. He's been everywhere, and anywhere since this invasion happened. Anyway, Danny, where can anyone listen to us?
They can get us pretty much anywhere and everywhere you can get a podcast, Graham. That includes Spotify, it includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Podcast Addict, Podcast Republic. Literally anywhere, lads. You can make Alexa play us if you want to. Have a chat with Alexa. Ask her for us, and we'll pop up talking to you through your little magic box that appears. All you have to do is search WTS Pod. There we are.
He's at Danjo Murray. I'm at Merrigan Mania. We have a couple of podcasts lined up over the next 3 to 4 weeks, so we'll see you next week.
A few doozies.
Once the guest does not pull out. But anyway, Lenny, until next time.
Clear eyes.
Full hearts.
Heart loose.
Too sweet.